So I'm gonna do a quick video here, just kind of giving my thoughts in perhaps some advice for people that are looking to submit short stories to literary magazines. I mentioned, and this idea came to me just because I mentioned I'm working on my short story right now. I'm doing some revisions to that, and I've been sort of thinking about, okay, if I was gonna look to submit two short stories, kind of at the start, some years earlier, what advice would I have gotten, or what advice would I have been looking for? So to start all this, I want to offer that it seems that literary magazines, and especially the process of the slush pile, it seems almost the reverse publishing process to how it might have been done maybe half a century earlier. And what I mean by that is if you go back, 50, 60 years, people basically got their novels published because what they would do is they would submit to various literary magazines, build up a bit of a small audience, and get agents and editors' eyes on their work, and then eventually they would publish a novel, or they'd write their novel, and they would have that weight from their short stories behind them to sort of give them, kind of get their foot in the door and get them into, publication for that novel. Now, this process is still done today by a lot of authors, but I've also noticed that with more and more literary magazines, especially the very, very top tier ones, you can't necessarily start at the beginning of having no work, getting it published in these top level magazines, and then getting your novel published instead. Oftentimes, to get into the very, very top tier, you need to already have a literary agent representing you first to sort of get your work in front of their eyes, of these lit mags. So, just as a quick example, I remember reading there was a Reddit forum maybe a couple years ago, where some of the editors from the Paris Review were on there answering questions, and they had asked them, what percentage of your work comes from the slush pile, and I believe what they had said was something to the effect of, I think, one story in 6 months that they published actually came through the slush pile. Everything else they published was from someone that already had an agent submitted directly to an editor instead. And that's important to know if you are going to start querying lit mags, is understanding that if you are looking to get into the very top tier lit mags, you're going to probably already need an agent to back you up. It just because they're so competitive that having that connection to get in, and also having an agent that can basically advocate for you in a sense that can perhaps get a story that they might be on the fence about publishing. Having an agent basically to kind of fight for you in a sense basically sort of adds a bit more weight, and a bit more of your chances of getting in. So that's kind of the first point I want to stress, which is if you are looking at literary magazines, it might help to know or to look at and see what percentage basically of their work generally comes from the slush pile. You can Google this. Some lit mag, not every lit mag obviously mentions this. As a general rule, if you're going to be submitting to the slush pile, anything that's probably a tier below something like the Paris Review is going to be good. So any like university ones, any ones that are that have a reputation that's a little bit below that is probably going to be within your range to get into without a lit agent. Obviously, in any scenario, having an agent obviously is helpful, but I would say so anything kind of right below that tier, you'll have an okay chance of getting in. And I'm going to leave a link to an article that I read last year. I think it was called Litmag. I think it was like litmag.com or something like that. But basically what happened was in the article, the journalists had interviewed several different literary magazines, and they got editors from different ones. And they simply asked them, what percentage of your submissions come specifically from the slush pile versus ones that are solicited by you guys. And it turns out that the majority of the submissions that they get actually are from the slush pile. They're not solicited. They're not sent by literary agents. So that is very encouraging. I actually used to think that the number was actually far more skewed in terms of solicited requests than it actually turned out to be, which is awesome. So right there, right off the bat, that should be encouraging. Basically, that for most magazines that you submit to, going through the slush pile is going to be, a relatively safe thing if your work is up to quality and if what you submit is what the magazine is going to be looking for. All right, so let's get into sort of the practical considerations for, at least trying to stand out in the slush pile. So the main thing, obviously, that's going to get you accepted is just the quality of writing. Does your story match what the magazine is looking for, and is your work up to par? As far as the first part about does your work match the quality, basically, or does your work match the subject of what the magazine is looking for? A mistake people often make when they first start is that they'll just Google basically a bunch of lit magazines or look at ones that are taking submissions and just submit to them blindly. They don't do any actual research into what the magazine actually, likes as far as content. So what I'd recommend is just going back and buying 1 to 2 back issues of a certain magazine and just reading them, going through reading them, and just seeing, does this match the kind of stuff you write? If it does, perfect. The other thing that works well too, and the other reason why you'd want to consider doing this is when you submit your query, it can help if you cite a particular story that you recently read in the magazine and say something to the effect of, I was reading, in this month's issue of your magazine, I read story, insert the name of the story, and I noticed the tone. I noticed the tone was very similar to my tone, or the subject matter might be perhaps similar to what I write, so I hope this might be of similar interest to you. Just something that shows that you actually care, that you've actually put the effort into trying to match your work to what the subject matter that they prefer, will go a long way to actually having your work stick out. So that would be my first point, just simply actually reading the magazines and getting a feel if they actually match or not. Other thing, like I mentioned, was just the quality. Certainly, I mean, no one can really tell you if your work's up to par, unless you show them. So the main thing would be, if you're curious, if you have a writers group, it might help to have them take a look at your work and just see if the quality of your prose is up to the level it needs to be at to get into the magazines. But ultimately, it's going to come down to your own judgment. You sort of have to realize for yourself, hey, is my work there or is it not? So the next point is just making sure that you follow the guidelines of the magazine correctly. I know people tend to think they're the exceptions to the rules, so they'll read like the magazine submission and it might say, like a 7,000, word like maximum for submission, and you submit something that's 8,000 words, and you tell yourself, well, my writing's so good that, and I can't find a way to trim the story down, they'll just accept it. You're probably not the exception to the rule. If there are any kind of ways to bend it, your submission's probably not going to be the one that kind of gets away with that. So biggest thing is just sticking to the exact word count, sticking to the exact requirements that are required of this submission. And now on to the third point, which is making sure that your query letter for the magazine is short and concise. That's you don't need to go crazy on a query letter for a lit mag. Just having the very basic, couple lines will be fine. I'm going to throw up a quick thing on the screen here as kind of a template that perhaps you can use when querying lit mags, that I find tends to work well, if only because I know that I've gotten personal rejection responses before, so I know that they've at least someone has seen it and actually read it and not just sent some automated thing. So I'll throw it on the screen, but basically you want a simple, dear insert magazine, please consider story, put the word count in parentheses for submission. Next line should be list any kind of prior publications, and then list any sort of academic qualifications you might have. You have like an MFA or something like that. Insert some quick line about I have perhaps an MFA from this university, and then the last thing would be if you're doing a simultaneous submission to note that. So say this is a simultaneous submission. Thank you. Put your name down. Very simple, very straightforward stuff. But this is the template you probably are going to want to use when it comes to your query. You don't need to be fancy. You don't need to be clever at all. The more boring your query letter is, the better, just because for lack of a better term, they're going to know that you're not completely insane. As I've actually had an editor tell me one time, that's kind of the point of the query letter, is just to make sure that you are a rational human being that can follow directions. Okay, so a quick recap. First thing is know what magazines you are submitting to and know the content of what those magazines publish, and make sure that your work matches up with that. Again, I suggested perhaps reading some of their prior work and maybe even citing that in your query letter. Second thing was just making sure that your writing quality was up to par. So, which again, only you are going to really know that. So just making sure you have strong writing quality. And then the last thing is just having a very basic query letter to accompany it. If you can check all three boxes, I mean, you're giving yourself probably as good of a chance as any of getting into the lit mag that you are submitting to. This last part is going to be just a quick aside. As I was going through this, as I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do for a topic for today, I started thinking back to when I had first started writing, and I think one of the biggest flaws in my thinking was that I had in my mind the idea of going that initial route I had mentioned, where I was not going to ever publish a single short story until after my novel was published first. For me, it was that mentality of get a novel published, and with having a published novel, you have the credibility, plus you have the literary agent, and then you can submit to all the big top tier, lit mags, all the ones that are, that you want to get into long term, right? In essence, I view that as a way to sort of jump perhaps the mid tier literary magazine process. And looking back on it, that's such a flawed way of thinking. It's one of those things where I guess when you're young and you first start out, I think everyone has that delusions of grandeur in a sense, and you don't realize until later on that process and how kind of flawed it is. You shouldn't I don't think ever view anything like that. You should never view something as trying to leap over a certain process and attempting to view some means as below yourself. And especially when it comes to literary magazines, I'm at the point now where I think now they're almost a necessity to get into. It's a bit like being a garage band and then wanting to start becoming like a real professional band, and thinking that you're going to play like Carnegie Hall or play this massive stadium on your first show, right? That was kind of my thinking, in a sense, right? Like, yeah, just skip all the mid steps, get a novel published, and then just jump and publish to like the best lit mags there are. And I think people need to sort of do the lower tier lit mags, because there's so much rejection involved with it. Like they're not easy at all to get into. Even the lower ones, are even the mid tier ones, right? Like when I say mid tier, that's not a put down at all. They are extremely difficult to get into, and the quality of writing is so good. And I think for many people that are starting out writing, it's one of those things where you have to start practicing at the low levels, right? You're that garage band, you're playing, the local bar, the local city. It's the same thing with these lit mags. Like it's getting in there. It's just getting the confidence to know that you can get into the magazines. It's having someone else tell you and actually pay you money, albeit very small sum, actually paying you money for your writing to kind of build the confidence, to let you know that you're on the right path. And it builds up that CV. It builds up, your credentials for when you want to query, for when you want to get that novel in. It becomes, to have those credentials behind you adds a whole lot of weight. And so I think for everyone, you should be looking at trying to get into as many lit mags really as you can, and not be as concerned necessarily with getting into the top tier ones or the top quality ones from the start. And it's a bit of a tough pill, I think, to swallow. I think for me, I mean, even looking back at my thinking now, it's like it's still kind of a tough, sort of thing to accept. Basically, the idea basically that your first work can't be in that, that top magazine. Your first thing you ever published, your debut short story, it's not gonna be in the one that gets celebrated. You're probably not gonna win an award for your first short story, and it sucks and it's hard, but that's, I think, in a lot of ways, the writing process as a whole, right? Like your debut novel is not necessarily going to be an award-winning novel, probably, right? It might be, it may be, but more often than not, it's one of those things where the first thing you put out, the first thing that gets accepted into anywhere, is never going to be your best work, and you shouldn't be so attached to having your debut be this massive, amazing thing. It should just be viewed as the next step along a greater journey, as you were. But yeah, so that's my video here. I do hope it helps. Any kind of questions on submitting to lit magazines, or any kind of questions on the slush pile, feel free to message me and leave a comment down below.